Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to OETC and Microsoft's M365 webinar series. I'm James Kelly, OETC's marketing coordinator. Today's session will go over Windows application and policy deployment best practices in Microsoft Intune. We'll cover the different application types, how to create a self-service application catalog for your end users, and how policy management differs from group policy to Intune. This session will be presented by Richard Balsley, Principal Technical Specialist on Microsoft's education team. The session is being recorded and will be sent out next week as well. There'll be time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Here, I'll take a quick moment to highlight OETC's renewal team, some of whom are on today's webinar. If you have any licensing questions, you can reach out to help@oetc.org, and someone from the team will be happy to assist you. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks a lot, James. So as James mentioned, my name is Richard Balsley. I'm a principal specialist here at Microsoft. And if you were on the last session that we did around enrollment, this is a continuation of that session. And so with that, as James had mentioned, we're really going to talk about two main topics, the two topics that I get the most questions about. How do I manage my policies in Microsoft Intune? And also, how do I manage applications? And policy management, if you've tried doing any of this already, you might have noticed that things are a little bit different when you come from your on-premises group policy environment to Microsoft Intune. And so we're going to talk about what this concept is called configuration profiles, which sounds different than group policy, but the reality is that it's really not that much different at all. Then we're going to talk about conflict management. What happens when we have conflicts between a device that might be on your domain and it's managed through group policy, but you're also using Intune to deploy applications and settings, and what happens when we have conflicts between the two. And then lastly, we're going to talk a lot about how to migrate GPOs, and does it really make sense to migrate all of your GPOs from on-prem to Microsoft Intune? And then lastly, we'll have a lot of time to go over application management and deployment, best practices on what you should do there. And then, as James had mentioned, we're going to talk about how to self-service application deployment. So how can you create an experience for your users to go and pick the applications they want to install, as opposed to you making everything required. So let's start with configuration profiles. And what is a configuration profile? Well, the configuration profile is just a selection of settings that you deploy out to your devices. There are different settings and features that can be enabled or disabled on different devices within the organization. Configuration profiles can be applied to really any device type, whether it's iOS, Android, Windows, or Mac OS. And so what do they provide? As I mentioned earlier, device features. So we can deploy things like AirPrint for Apple. You can deploy how to turn or disable that feature. We can also control how notifications are sent to a device or how lock screen messages are displayed on different platforms. But we also can restrict the device. And that's primarily what most people want to do. They want to restrict certain things so users can't do something. So if you have student devices that are running Windows, you probably don't want them to have access to be able to access the Microsoft Store. Like, they shouldn't go to the public store and download whatever application they want. So you can create a device restriction through a configuration profile that prevents them from doing that. We can also require pins, and we can require BitLocker to be turned on. All of these things are restrictions. But then we also have access configuration. So things like email profiles, VPN profiles, Wi-Fi profiles, or even certificates. If you want to control how we get access to resources within the environment, then we'll use a configuration profile to do that. And then lastly, custom configuration profiles. These would be things that don't really have a template or a specific setting within Intune. You have to go and customize this either through a script or maybe even a custom setting within Intune. And we'll talk more about those when we go through the demo of what these custom settings actually look like. Now, when we have our settings, we have to assign them to something. We have to target them to something. So with something like group policy, you would create a GPO, and then you would select an organizational unit within Active Directory in order to assign that GPO to something. Well, within Intune, we don't really have the concept of organizational units. We use groups. Specifically, we use Azure Active Directory groups to target configuration profiles. And so when we target these things, we can target them to either user groups or device groups. And it's not all that dissimilar from what you're doing with group policy, where you might target user-specific policies to an organizational unit that contains users. We do pretty much the same thing within Intune. So if you have settings that you want to target to user groups, then those settings will travel with that user to whatever device they go to. And so what's interesting about that in an education environment is that we have students that use multiple device types. They might have a one-to-one device that you've given them, but there might also be shared devices that they use. They could use shared carts all the time in the classroom and then go to a desktop that might be in a lab. Well, do you want the settings that you're targeting to that student to go to every single machine? Settings maybe, but applications maybe not. Applications, you may not want those to travel from a shared cart machine to a lab machine that is used for a specific purpose. So when you're thinking about targeting settings, is what we're talking about, right now, profiles, those can generally travel around with a user. Applications, maybe, maybe not. And so when we're targeting devices, which is what we're primarily managing within an education environment, we usually manage the device. We don't necessarily target things to users. And so when we target our settings to a device, it works as you'd expect. Those settings will just apply to that device, and they don't travel around to any other device because it's just targeted to that specific machine. And so profiles can be assigned to one or more. A device can have one or more user or device configuration profiles assigned to them. But you also have the ability to exclude groups or exclude users from a profile assignment. So imagine that maybe you're assigning something to the whole entire organization, but then you want to limit or you want to exclude a group of devices or users from that setting. This could be like maybe you have a superintendent or something that they're a VIP within the organization, and you don't want them to have a specific setting that you're locking everyone else down with, but maybe you only want them or a group of VIPs to have access to something like that. So you can use exclude groups to exclude those profiles from them. Now, when it comes to exclusions, when we have an exclusion and an inclusion, the exclusion will always take precedence. And so when we're including user groups, but we're including user groups, but then we're also excluding other user groups, the exclusion is going to take precedence for them. Now, we recently introduced a new feature called filters. And filters allows an admin to include or exclude devices in a group based on admin specified criteria. Now, I know that this slide is a bit busy here, but the way that filters works are that, let's say that we're targeting a large group of devices. Let's say we're just targeting the all devices group in Intune, but we don't want every device to have that filter. We might only want just the personal devices. So in the picture here where it says number 1, create the filter, we're actually creating a device filter called personal. And then we're taking that filter and we're assigning it to we're assigning an application or policy to a group of users. And in this case, we're targeting the group of finance users, but this could be a group like your all users group. And we're saying that we want to exclude the personal devices of that finance users group. So this could be something like, I've got a personal Windows device that I'm using at home, and I'm trying to access my email in that scenario. But my IT department wants to target something to me, but they don't want to target my personal Windows device that I use at home to access my email. They only want to target the device that they have given me. And so in that case, I can use a filter to say, I want to assign this to the finance users, to my user group, but I want to remove that personal device that I've been accessing at home to get my mail. And so on the back end, what we do is we evaluate when the device checks in to see, is this a personal device or is it a corporate device or is it an organizationally owned device? And if it's not a personal device, then we'll allow that assignment to work. But if it is a personal device, then we will not allow it to assign. And so you can look at this and we can report on this. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at filters because they're very important when it comes to deploying applications and settings within Intune. But this gives you more of a high-level overview of exactly how the filter process works and how we can use very large groups to deploy something out, but then filter based on certain criteria to scale that down. And it's also a much faster way of deploying things as well. And so we'll talk more about that as we get into the demo. Now, when it comes to configuration profile delivery, there's always a lot of questions that I get around, when do devices check in, or when do the policies or profiles that I'm assigning, when do they make it down to the device? And so if the device is online, then by default, the device will check in every 8 hours. And this is for nearly all platforms. We have this documented on our docs site that goes through every single device platform and the check-in period. But generally speaking, for a Windows device, every 8 hours, the device will check in. Now, when the device is offline, well, it can't check in. However, when the device gets turned online and turns on, connects out to the internet, at the next scheduled check-in, when the device is online, it will then check in. So this could, again, be about every 8 hours. However, what's interesting about Intune is that when a device is online and you're creating a brand new profile. So let's just imagine that we've created a new profile to, lock down, I don't know, BitLocker, Microsoft Store, what have you. And we want that to happen immediately. Well, I just told you that it takes 8 hours for the device to check in. You might think, well, that's a really long time. But what also happens when you create a brand new profile is that Intune will immediately notify a device, hey, there's a new profile available and you need to check in now. And so usually this happens within probably about 15 minutes, 30 minutes, could even be within 5 minutes. Just there is some flexibility there. But you will have that notification happen very, very quick compared to this 8-hour time frame. So as soon as you're creating a profile, we'll immediately notify the devices that are online, hey, you need to check in, and they'll check in and they'll get that profile relatively quick. Now, if the device is offline when you do this, then Intune is going to try to notify that device up to 4 times. It'll say, hey, check in, but if the device isn't on, it's not going to check in. Now, if the device doesn't respond, then it's going to get its updated configuration profile on its next scheduled check-in. So we will attempt on the service side on Intune to push out a request, hey, device, you need to check in. We'll do that 4 times. And if it doesn't happen, then it's going to wait for that 8-hour interval. So it could take a little while for that machine if it didn't get that check-in within the first 4 times. Okay, so now what happens when we conflict from a policy perspective? So you can have confliction really in a couple different ways. You can have confliction within Intune, where you have 2 separate policies that are targeted to one machine. But then you also can conflict when you have group policy and you have Intune. And the way that we handle these are actually two different ways. So in the Intune only scenario, where we have 2 policies that we're assigning to the same machine, we have compliance policies and we have configuration profiles. And so compliance policy settings will always have precedence over configuration profile settings. This is not a super common scenario for you in general. However, when it comes to configuration policies, that's the highlighted box I have, or the third one. If a configuration policy setting conflicts with a setting in another configuration policy, then this conflict is actually shown in Intune. And that conflict has to be manually resolved. So you cannot handle, the Intune does not automatically handle that conflict. Whereas with something like group policy, you have precedence within group policy. You can have a hierarchical order to say which GPOs will apply over other GPOs. Intune, it's not the same way. So if I've got 2 of the same exact configuration being set on the same device, nothing is going to change on that device. That conflict is going to have to be manually resolved within Intune somehow. So you might have to go and remove the profile that's being assigned to, one of the 2 profiles will have to be removed from the assignment. And there's a report in Intune that will tell you that these conflicts exist. So when you're looking at the reporting status of a profile, you can go in there and see which profiles are being conflicted and how to go about resolving those. Now, for hybrid Azure AD join devices, group policy will win over any Intune configuration profile that's being assigned. Because the way that this works is that group policy or a device that's joined to Active Directory on premises, the group policies there will always have priority over the Intune configuration profiles, because that device is domain joined, its identity provider is Active Directory. And so that's always, that on-premises environment will always take precedence over anything that's being deployed into Intune. Now, there is a policy that you can set to say, I want Intune to take precedence over whatever we have set over group policy. That policy can be set in Intune, and it basically tells the device, if there is a conflict between GPO and Intune, let Intune win. I don't have it documented here in the slide, but it's there is a way to work around that. Now, migrating your Windows 10/Windows 11 GPOs to Intune, there's a tool within Intune called Group Policy Analytics, and we'll look at that here in a bit. But the way that this works is that you can take the XML from a GPO that you have exported from on-premises, and we can upload that into Intune. Intune will then analyze that GPO, and it'll map the appropriate MDM settings from the GPO into Intune, and will tell you of the settings that you have in your group policy, which will apply which can be applied via Intune and which cannot. And then from there, we can create a policy set for you within Intune so that you can deploy those policies out. And so we're going to look at that here in just a bit. But before we get into that, we should really talk about, should we actually move our GPOs over to Intune? This is a very common question. It's like we've got hundreds or thousands of GPOs on premises that we've set for 20 years. And we have no idea which of them still apply, which work. We haven't cleaned up GPO in forever. The GPO was created, the GPOs that we have today were created by people that no longer are even with our organization. But we're afraid to change them because we don't know what's going to happen or what's going to break. And so the question again is, should you move all your GPOs into? In a word, no. You shouldn't do this. And in two letters, no, we shouldn't. You shouldn't do it. You should not do this. And the reason for this is, again, because you're taking over a lot of what we call technical debt, or you have a lot of baggage that has been carried over for years that could be impacting performance. You may not even realize that it's impacting performance. You just might think, well, the Windows devices just run like this. But if you haven't blocked inheritance and just joined a machine to your domain in a long time and seen what the native experience of Windows is on your machines, then it's probably been a while since you've actually seen them. You don't realize that maybe we are losing some performance by having a lot of GPOs, or maybe even logon scripts or various other things that are being deployed through group policy that could be slowing our devices down. So when you think about GPO, you really need to think about how long your GPOs have been around and when was the last time someone reevaluated those policies, because I'm willing to bet that you've probably got a lot of policies in there that no one's touched in years. Me and my team, we talk to customers all the time, and usually when this conversation comes up, there's a lot of heads that start nodding when we ask, you probably have a lot of policies that haven't been touched in a long time, right? And they usually say, yeah. In some cases, we've seen customers that have had policies that were created back in Windows, like when Windows 2000 came out, and those policies today would be about 22 years old. You might have group policies that are older than employees. If it goes that far back and you've got some relatively new employees to your organization, you could potentially have policies that are older because of how old AD and group policy are now. So with that, let's take a look at the console and what we've got on the Intune side of things for policy management. So when it comes to policies, you're hearing me say the word policy a lot, and then configuration profiles. These terms are interchangeable. when you're thinking of group policy, just think of configuration profiles in Intune. They're effectively the same thing. Now, in my environment, I've got a ton of different policies. I mean, you can see on my screen, I've got lots of different things for lots of different reasons. And what you'll notice in this profile type column over here is that I've got different profile types in my environment. I got settings catalog, I've got device restrictions, I've got custom, I've got endpoint protection, addition upgrades. And so these different profile types can be created through the Create Profile wizard. And so we select Create Profile, we can specify the different platforms that we want to manage. And so this webinar is really designed for Windows 10. But if you're also looking at managing Mac or iOS, then this is also where you would create your Mac and iOS and Android policies too. So I'm going to select Windows 10 and later. And then I've got two different types of profiles. I've got templates and I've got and then I've got settings catalog. I'm going to talk about templates first, and then we'll dive into settings catalog. But with templates, templates are really just a collection of various settings that would work for a specific category of those types of settings. So for instance, if I wanted to manage Wi-Fi profiles, I've got a Wi-Fi profiles template that I can go and create an enterprise wireless profile and target that to my devices. If my enterprise wireless just so happened to be like EAP TLS and I leverage certificates to get access to wireless, then I can also create a certificate profile using SCEP certificates or using PKCS certificates. So this is where you would go to create, those types of profiles. But also, as you can see, there's a lot of other things in here as well. Device restrictions, talked a lot about this at the beginning of the webinar, how we restrict the device. And then we've also got custom. I mentioned custom profiles earlier, where we can set custom settings that don't really have any Intune user interface yet. So I might go into here and create, some custom setting. Like I might work with Google, or I could go work with some third-party vendor, and they might say, "Hey, you need to go and create this custom setting in Intune, and here is the documentation. Here are the steps of creating that custom profile." And they'll have, you'll just basically copy and paste some of that stuff into the custom setting here. And so with these profiles, if I look at endpoint protection, if you're managing Microsoft Defender, this is where you would go to create your Defender definition settings. So if I just call this Defender, hit next, you'll see I've got all the different Defender products here, because as you might know, Defender is a suite of products now. It's not just the antivirus on the machine. And so in here, I can go and configure how, things like Defender Application Guard, how firewall is configured on the machine. I can also go in here and look at like encryption, how is BitLocker configured on the machine. So lots of different settings for this profile type. Now, if we go back, let's go back and take a look at the other profile type in here that I had called settings catalog. Now, settings catalog is where I suspect that most of you will probably spend the most of your time, is because with settings catalog, we've taken device restrictions and some of the other profile types, and we've moved those settings from those profile types into the settings catalog. And you might think, well, Microsoft, why are you giving me another place to manage settings? Like, I'm already used to device restrictions. I'm used to these templates that you have here. Now you're moving everything over to this new settings catalog. Like, what's the point? And I'm just going to give this a name here and go through and explain the point. So with settings catalog, this makes it easier to search for a setting that you're interested in setting on your devices. With the other templates that I was showing you, you needed to know what template to use and where to go to set that thing. So like if I was doing something for Defender, like I just looked at Defender, right? If I do a search for Defender, again, it's a suite of products, I'm going to get a lot of hits for Defender. I'm not sure what the search is doing it that way. DFENDR, yeah. Well, what I was expecting it to do is just actually show me just the Defender node here, and then show me all of the different settings for that. And so as you search for different things, like instead of doing Defender, let's just do something like BitLocker, or not BitLocker, Bluetooth. So when you do a search for something, it scales down the categories to only the things that that you care about within that search. So if you're searching for Bluetooth, it's going to give me everything that has Bluetooth within the name of the policy. So you're seeing that I've got an admin template here for Google Chrome, which, by the way, is something relatively new within the last maybe couple weeks. We've just added the Google Chrome ADMX settings into Intune. So now if you wanted to manage Chrome, you could just do a search for Chrome, look at the administrative templates, and then start to create your settings catalog settings to control how the Chrome browser is used. But for Bluetooth, I'm going to go and select connectivity here. You might think, hey, let me go look at Bluetooth. Like if you wanted to block Bluetooth, you actually need to go under connectivity, because under connectivity, that's where Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and a number of other connectivity settings are actually underneath. So when I look for Bluetooth, click on connectivity, I can then select allow Bluetooth. And then over here, this is where I can control whether Bluetooth is actually allowed or not on my devices as I deploy this setting out. So I can select disallow Bluetooth, but then I might also want to put other settings in here. As I was saying that, there's the Bluetooth category here. If I click on this, I can then look to see how the Bluetooth radio is configured. Now, if I'm disallowing Bluetooth, I don't need to configure this. But if I was allowing Bluetooth, but then I decided, okay, I want to maybe not allow advertising, or maybe I don't want to show like the local device name, and I can select these additional settings in here and block advertising, and I can specify whatever my local device name is. So as you're building your settings out, you can go through and search for different things. Like maybe you want to block Cortana. This is another common thing that education customers want to do, is they want to limit if Cortana is used or not. And so within here, I can go and select that I want to block Cortana. Look at Microsoft Store. I mean, kind of get the idea. Go find the settings you want, select the setting, and then go and block that setting, or allow the setting if you need to. So I've got some settings here. Now I need to deploy these settings. And so I mentioned earlier targeting groups and devices, and then oftentimes we're going to probably target devices. Now, if I were to target all devices for something, that's generally one of those career limiting moves that I could possibly get in trouble for if I'm targeting my all devices group. It might make better sense to target a smaller group for maybe all my students, or specific student devices, or maybe specific labs, or various different groups that are in the environment. But remember, I mentioned filters earlier. And so with filters, I can filter out and only allow specific devices that fall into my filter. So in the example that I showed earlier, I showed actually using a group of users. So instead it was something like this, where we had the finance user group, but then I was excluding some other machines. Well, I can also do the inverse of that. I can say I want to include specific machines. So I'll say I want to do all users, but I only want to do specific devices within those users. And so I've got a number of filters here. One of those is an include. I can include or exclude based on the filters that I've set up here. So I've got a group here for specific models. Like this filter here looks at Dell. Specifically, it looks at a Dell Latitude 3189, or it's looking for devices that contain Surface, or the device manufacturer is Acer. So I can create a filter that looks at multiple device types and says, you know what, I'm going to target this to all users, but only install if the device model is a Latitude 3189, or if the device model contains Surface in the name, or if the device manufacturer is something else. I can also do the same thing with like my Laptop Go, where in this case, I'm looking at the device name must start with CONT for Contoso, and so it's got to have the device name of Kant, and it has to be a Surface Laptop Go model. And so by using filters, what this does is it makes it so that I don't have to micromanage groups so much. I can have a smaller number of groups in my environment, but I can use a filter to filter out. And you might think, well, I either have to create a lot of filters or I got to create a lot of groups, but I got to create something somewhere. So why would I use filters? Well, what filters do is that what you're looking at in this scenario here, where I'm filtering on a a specific set of devices. Think about this from a student perspective, where a student, again, students move from device to device, but I don't want my lab machines to ever be touched. I don't want settings or applications that are targeted to a user to roam with them to a set of devices that are for a specific purpose. Like if I've got a lab machine, it's probably got specific software on it. It could have like Adobe Creative Cloud, Photoshop, Autodesk, something that is specific for that purpose. And I don't want any of that student stuff to touch that machine because I'm configuring that a specific way. And so for these settings, I only want to target the user, but only specific devices, or I want to exclude. I might have this as an exclude to say, you know what, don't allow my lab machines. So I can use an exclude rule and say, if my lab machines were a Surface Laptop Go, for instance, then don't include my lab machines in this policy. And so that makes it easier for you to target things, but then just remove the devices that you don't want. They're also faster, because when you deal with dynamic groups in Intune, dynamic groups, it takes a while for devices and users to fall into those dynamic groups. Whereas when I leverage filters, there's no reliance on Azure Active Directory. Everything is self-contained within Intune. So filters actually gives you a faster experience when it comes to evaluating the device that you're targeting your application or setting to. So I've got my user group here. I've got my filter set up. I can take this setting, target it, review the settings, and then deploy the setting out. And I'm not going to actually deploy this. I don't need to, but you get the idea of how to create using the settings catalog and deploying the settings out to a group of users or devices, and then leveraging a filter to filter out or include or exclude different devices or users that you may or may not want to include. So settings catalog is probably where you're going to spend the most of your time. That's where we recommend most of the policy management that you're going to be doing, or the profile management. Do most of that there. Now, what you won't be able to do, if we go back and just kind of look at the templates, things like custom settings you can't do through settings catalog. The addition upgrades, you won't be doing that. Email profiles, you won't be doing any of that. Your certificates all have to have separate. You'll have to use the templates through here, VPN, Wi-Fi. All of those settings will have to be done through templates. So you're still going to use templates for certain things, but when it comes to device restrictions and setting actual settings on devices, a lot of these templates are being migrated over to settings catalog. So if you're new to all of this, brand new, haven't touched Intune before, and you're just doing this for the first time, start with a settings catalog. Look through there to apply your settings. Again, it's a lot easier to search for settings in there rather than going through some of these other template types, because you have to know the exact setting you want to set, and you'd have to know the category and the exact location. And so it's a little bit more difficult to find those things if you're new and not used to this. Okay, so those are the configuration profiles. Now let's talk about group policy analytics. So I mentioned earlier that we can migrate policies over into Intune from your group policy. And so what I've done here is I've imported my default domain policy from my lab environment in Active Directory. Now, this default domain policy is literally the default domain policy that you get in your domain controller when you first stand up a domain controller. And so there's a lot of really, really old policies in there. Actually, hang on, let me go back real quick. There's a lot of really, really old policies in here. And so that's why you see MDM support in this column here. It's telling me that only 33% of these policies are actually supported by MDM. Because again, these policies have been around for like 20 years. And so a lot of these policies aren't even needed anymore. And so this is also telling me that this currently exists in Active Directory and is being targeted. And I imported this about a month ago. And so when I click into this, and I look at the MDM support for my policy, I can see all the stuff that is set to no and yes. And the ones that are set to yes, on the far right, we give you the CSP mapping. So CSP, what does CSP stand for? CSP is a configuration service provider. So when you see CSP or you hear us talking about CSPs, when it comes to Windows, it refers to configuration service provider. Think of this as group policy. Think of CSP is the equivalent to group policy. And so with the CSP mapping column, this is to be a little complicated to understand here. I'm trying to see if I can pull this over so you can see what all this looks like. Give me a sec. That might be the best we can do for now. But basically what the CSP mapping is doing is it's telling you that, you're probably used to looking at the registry and looking at policies there and how things are configured in the registry. This kind of looks like a registry path, sort of. But this is basically telling you that the CSP mapping for this specific maximum password age policy, this is the CSP that is mapped, on the back end in Intune and within Windows. Now, you don't need to worry about this. You only need to worry about this when you're doing custom policy settings. And this is where I was telling you earlier, like you could go through, work with Google, or you can work with some third party, and they might give you some custom third party settings that you have to set within Intune. And they might give you something that looks like this in this string. And you would just copy and paste this information in from your vendor into a custom policy setting. But you never, primarily, you're not spending a lot of your time doing custom settings. But we map that in this tool. But we just recently allowed for the ability to migrate these settings easily over to the settings catalog. And so what you can do is you can click on this migrate button up here. And what it does is it shows you all of the MDM policies that are in or all the group policies that are in the actual GPO itself, but it only allows you to select the ones that have MDM support. And so I can click on a few of these here and then click on next. And then it tells me which settings were selected and the values for those settings. And if I click on next, this is going to allow me to name what this settings catalog object is going to be. And so I'm just going to put do not use because I do not want to use these. But it's going to create them in my environment. And so I can then also assign these right away. But I don't want to assign them. I actually want to see what this is going to do within Intune. So I'm not going to assign this right now. And then I can create it. So this is migrating my XML from on-premises, and it's taking that and creating a settings catalog object within Intune. And so over here, I see this do not use. And it's a settings catalog object, like I said. And within the settings catalog, if I go down here to configuration settings, this tells me the different settings that it applied. And so again, you can migrate your group policy settings from on-premises over to Intune. Again, I really caution you, don't do this unless you absolutely know that you are going to pull those settings over. Like, you need this setting, that's fine. But don't just take your XML, import it, copy everything over, because now you've just carried over 20 plus years potentially of GPO. You just carry that all over to Intune. And once you do this, you probably don't go back and change it. Now you got another 20 years of policies that may not need to be set anymore. So really think about what you're pulling over from GPO, because it does really impact the performance of your devices. And you can even look to see if group policies are impacting the performance of your devices using something called Endpoint Analytics in Intune. Because within Endpoint Analytics, and I know this is outside of the application piece, but because we're talking about group policy and performance, what I want to show here is that Endpoint Analytics can show you your startup performance, and it can explain how long it takes for your devices to start. And there's one thing in here that says group policy. And so now I don't have any devices that are joined to my on-premises domain, but if I did have devices that were joined to on-premises and they were in hybrid Azure AD join state, I can get telemetry and analytical data that tells me how long the group policy phase takes me to get to my desktop. And so if you're curious, if you're doing domain joined machines today that are hybrid Azure AD joined, you could turn on Endpoint Analytics, gather the data, and see how long your group policies are actually impacting perf. It might surprise you how much time that group policy application might actually take. Okay, that's a bit of a tangent. Now let's talk about applications. So application management, I don't have any slides on this. I'm just going to do this all through demo. But with application management, as you know, we can manage multiple device types. We're primarily going to be focused on Windows, though, so I'm going to click into here on my Windows apps. And what you'll see here is that I've got a lot of applications that are in my environment that are different types. I've got Windows MSI line of business apps. I've got Windows app Win32. I've got store applications. I've got web links. And you might wonder, like, okay, what are the differences between some of these? So when you go and create a brand new app, this is where we can go and specify the app types. And so I just talked about store apps. I talked about web links, line of business, and Win32. What I didn't talk about are N365 apps and Edge. Now, Edge isn't really needed anymore. You can kind of throw this out. This was needed for a bit when we were moving from the old Edge in Windows 10 to the new Chromium-based Edge that we have now. And so this was necessary, but right now it's really not that necessary, unless you're maybe deploying like the dev channel, or if you're deploying like the beta channels or something like that. But for the most part, the stable channel of Edge is built into Windows 10 and Windows 11 today. You don't really have to worry about it. But N365 apps, if you don't know, we renamed Office Pro Plus to N365 apps. So this is just Office. So we provide you a built-in Office experience directly into Intune. So you don't even have to package up Office if you don't want to. And so when you go through and deploy Office through this way, there's a wizard that comes up and it goes through and shows you exactly how to pick and choose the different Office applications you want to install. It's all wizard based. It's very, very simple and easy to deploy Office. But the applications that you're probably the most concerned about are the third-party applications like Adobe Reader, Firefox, Zoom, Chrome, all of those other applications that you generally have to package up and deploy in some tool. And so deploying those applications, there's really two different ways of doing it. You have this line of business app here, which if I select this, it's a pretty easy way to deploy my applications. I select line of business app, select this file, and it's going to prompt me for a MSI or a number of different file types here. But for Windows, it's really just looking for a single file MSI. And so if I go into go to my device here, go to my temp folder, and go down to Win32 apps. And so if I pick Firefox, gives me the information. It's Mozilla Firefox, tells me that it's a per machine installer. So this would install in a per device instance on a machine. It pre-populates a bunch of information here for me. Interestingly enough, it doesn't populate the publisher. So I got to type that in. But everything else for the most part is pre-populated. I can just take the defaults, very easy to deploy and assign. If I wanted to assign this to a group, I can do that. I can assign it to all my devices or my all users group. Somewhat similar to what we saw with my my configuration profiles. What's a little bit different though when we're assigning applications is that I can also assign them to make them available to enrolled devices. And so when I do this, this is what allows me to make applications available in a self-service manner. So remember we talked about how we can create this self-service catalog for my end users to install their own applications. We're going to look at a device in a second where you can see what that self-service experience looks like. But how we set that up initially is we target applications and make them available for a device that's enrolled into Intune. And so I can target all users, or I can target a group of users and make this available to those users. I can also do uninstalls. So I can target an uninstall to a group of devices or a group of users as well. For maybe an application that maybe I have a licensed application like Adobe Creative Cloud, and I've used all my licenses up, and I know that there's a group of people that don't need it anymore. Well, I can deploy an uninstall to a group and remove the application remotely from Intune, without, as opposed to having to go to that device manually or having the end user uninstall it and then having them tell me they uninstalled it, so I can give that license to someone else. And so I took my MSI, I uploaded it, and that was easy, right? I just uploaded MSI. I didn't have to do anything special. There was nothing special here about uploading this MSI. It's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. But we don't recommend doing this. And there's a reason why we don't recommend this line of business app type. The reason is that it's not a very intelligent application type, meaning that when I deploy this out, it just installs and that's it. And if it already exists on the machine, doesn't matter. It'll attempt to install again. And depending on how the application behaves when it detects the presence of it already being there, it may work fine, it may not work fine. Generally, applications kind of know if they're already there, and so they kind of they know how to handle themselves. But you may not have an application that's like that. And so again, there's just no intelligence behind this application type. And so what we've done, not to mention that this application type, what if you have an application that has multiple folders and files? Talking about Adobe Creative Cloud, that's got lots of folders and files in it. It's a pretty big application type. It's not just a simple single file MSI. And so you couldn't even use the MSI line of business app for Creative Cloud. You'd have to use something else. And so what we recommend is leveraging Win32 apps. And so if we go and create one of those, what's the experience like compared to the MSI? Well, it's going to be very different, actually. It's the same in the sense that we still have to upload a file. But when I upload my files, I'm not uploading an MSI file. I have to upload this file that has this kind of a weird file extension called .intune win. So this .intune win file extension, how do you get that? How do you make a Intune win file? Well, you have to package the application. And so the way that I do this is that I create a folder called Win32 app. And then inside of that folder, I've got two separate folders. I've got a source folder and I've got an output folder. And the source folder is all of the different applications that I want to deploy. So I've got the source for Chrome. It's just a single file MSI. You can't see it here because I'm filtered, but if I do all files, you can see that my source here for Chrome is just the MSI, Firefox, the MSI, Remote Help. It's a new tool that we have to deploy or to remotely manage machines through Intune. That comes as an executable. So I couldn't even upload this through that MSI type that we were looking at earlier. I would have to package it as Win32 anyway. So again, that's a single file MSI as well. Zoom, again, single file MSI. But I do have the Office deployment toolkit, or the Office deployment tool here. And this is actually downloaded version of Office. So if I wanted to deploy this specific release of Office, I've got the source files for this, and this is multiple files and folders. And so with all of this, what I do, again, I create a folder structure under source that has all of my source files. And then I make an output folder. And so when I create this Intune win file, it just dumps all of those files out into this output folder. And so these Intune win files can be used, and I can upload them directly into here. But again, how do I create that Intune win file? Well, to create the file, there's an application that you need to use, and it's a command line utility called Intune win app util. And where you get that is if you go into our documentation, there's a page for Win32 app management overview. You can just do a search for this, or you can, afterwards, I can post a link here in the chat. But this goes through and explains how to package up your Win32 applications. And in this page, there is a link to a tool on GitHub right here. It says, for more information, see steps, prepare your Win32 app content for upload. This will take you to a page where it has this link here for converting the content. And so when you click into this will take you to GitHub. On GitHub, this is where you can download the Intune Win App utilization tool, or the utility. You can click on code, download zip. This will then download the file, and the zip file that it creates will contain that Intune Win App util.exe file. So once you get this file, again, this is just the way I do it. You don't have to do things the same way I'm doing it, but I like putting all of this stuff into one folder. You know, I've got my Win32 app folder, my output, my source, and then I've got the exe file. So what does this exe file look like when we try to run it? What does it do? I don't need to run as admin, but I'll just do it anyway. So if we look at the command line switches that we have, we've got -v, -h, -c. -c is the one that you're primarily going to be dealing with. -c is looking for the source folder location. So if I do ctemp, we'll do Win32 app. Actually, before I do this, I'll just delete Firefox here. Okay. No, I don't already have the file. So C Win32 app, and then my source is going to be Firefox. So that's my folder. And then what's the setup file that I have in there? The setup file, just go in here and grab it, in the name. So we got the name there. It's got some spaces in it. Not too crazy about files with spaces in the name. And then the output folder. So where are we going to put this? Win32 app and then output. Okay. And then there's also a -a for catalog folder. I never really use that. And then you can do a -q for quiet. Don't ever really need quiet. I mean, you could use quiet if you want, but if you don't do quiet, you're going to get the data that looks like this. Just kind of gives you some info. It's real quick. And now the file's been made. And so if I go into my output folder has my Firefox setup right here. Just created right now. And so what this does is it basically takes the content and it encrypts it. And so when you upload it to Intune, it's an encrypted file, and it's also compressed. Now, MSI files in general are already pretty well compressed, so you're not saving yourself a ton of space. But if you have another application type that has just a bunch of individual files in it, the compression will help in order to upload it, to make the upload a bit faster. And so we've got the file. Now we just need to upload it. So if I go back, get out of here, and if I go back and upload my application file, I'll just take Firefox again. And so passes some information into it. Again, looks very similar. I have to fill in the publisher still. One thing you may want to also do is add logos to your apps. And you'll want to do this for the self-service catalog that I'm about to show you here in a minute. But if you don't add the logos, then the applications all have this gray box, and they all look the same, and it's kind of difficult for people to understand what app is what. And so we've got Mozilla here. Now, when I'm doing MSI files, what's great about MSIs is that Intune can automatically populate the switches for you. But if they're not MSIs and you're doing an executable, then we don't really know what the install command is going to be. So you need to go and configure the switches for the applications that you're uploading. Now, just because we put the switches in for MSIs doesn't mean that you're done. You might need to add additional switches. Like if you have a VPN client like Global Protect, you might have an IP address that you use for the VPN to automatically connect to, or you might have some DNS or fully qualified domain name that you use to configure the Global Protect client to communicate out to the VPN. Then there might be additional switches in the MSI that you need to pass. So we'll pass just the basic quiet switches, but you need to pass some additional items as well. But for something like Firefox, I don't really need to pass anything else. I can just keep it as is. And so it's going to pre-populate that stuff for me. But I also have things in here that I can control that it won't pre-populate, like device restart behavior. Now, Firefox isn't going to restart anything, so I don't care about that. but sometimes you might have an application that does require a restart. And so the application may do the restart, or you might just say, you know what, Intune, I want you to do the restart of the device for me because the application doesn't handle it. And then there's just some other things around the return codes. And so if you know that you have an application that does something if a specific return code is passed, then you can come here and either add or modify the existing return codes. Now, most people don't do this. Most people don't adjust return codes here. They just kind of keep this stuff at the default behavior, but you do have that option if you need to use it. Now, from a requirements perspective, we can specify which, in order for this application to run, the device itself must meet these requirements. And so here I can say that the operating system must be 64-bit because I'm deploying a 64-bit version of Firefox. For minimum operating system, I generally don't set this, but if I have to, well, you actually have to set it. So I generally just set it to 1607. That's just the oldest that I can. It doesn't really matter what version of Windows 10 for something like Firefox to run. But I can also specify how much disk space is required. If I'm low on disk space, don't try to install because then you're going to use up all the disk space. You're probably end up with a failure. So you could specify in here that the disk space required for something like Firefox, I don't know what, 250 meg. That might be a good number to use. If you've got machines that have less than 250 megs of space, though, you probably have some pretty major problems going on that probably should be looked at that machine. Otherwise, they're going to have some pretty bad performance using that device. We can also specify physical memory that's required. I generally don't set a lot of these settings. I kind of just keep them as the defaults. But if you know that you need to set them, they're here for you. But the detection rules. So remember earlier I was talking about the MSIs and deploying those out, and that they're not very intelligent. They just deploy, they try to install, and if they try to install and it succeeds, great. If it fails, it'll report that back. But with a Win32 application, I can do a detection rule to check to see if the application is already on the machine ahead of time, and if it's not, if it's there, don't download. Don't make any attempt to install this app. But if it's not there, then go ahead and download the content, try to install. That other MSI type, it would have just downloaded the application and tried to run it, whether or not the app was there or not. So this is what I'm talking about with being intelligent versus not, in that the Win32 app types, you're building in intelligence into the application type so that Intune will attempt to install if it detects that the application is not there. And so with the detection rules, I can manually create my detection rule. And so here I have no rules are specified. So when I click on manual, I've got to go and click on add to create the rule. Now with MSIs, we actually pre-populate the MSI product code for you. Now this is great in some cases, but in other cases it may not be so great. And the reason I say that is because what I've noticed is with applications like Chrome, and it might be the same with Firefox, these applications update themselves. And what I've noticed is that sometimes the MSI product code, even though we use that to detect if the application is on the machine, sometimes the product code either changes or there's some weird interaction between like Chrome and Intune. And I don't know if it's the same with Firefox, it might be. But that the MSI product code detection isn't quite working the way we expect. And so what you end up seeing is it shows that like Chrome or Firefox might fail, but when you look at the device, they're actually there. And so what you need to do in some cases, it may not be all cases, but in some cases, if you're noticing that they're failing, go into File, and you can specify the path. I don't know if this is the exact path for Firefox. I don't know if it's Mozilla Firefox or if it's just I think it's Mozilla Firefox. But the path might be Mozilla Firefox, and then the file might be firefox.exe. And so you can create a detection rule that just says, look for this file and just check to see if the file exists. If it exists, don't even try to install. But you can even go a step further and say, okay, I'm looking for this file, but it needs to be a specific version. So the version must be greater than or equal to whatever version 96.1.1.1. I have no idea what the version number is for this. But you can basically do a version check to see if the version matches or not. And so that's how you can create the detection of the application to see if it exists on the machine. And then so I need to create my detection method. And then I've got my dependencies. So I can have, let's say that I have a application that requires, maybe something that requires Java, or it might require .NET, or some like middleware application. If that's the case, I can create a dependency chain. And I can say that in order for this application to install, Java must be there. And so I can go and select, I don't have Java in my environment, but let's just pretend that, OneDrive was Java. And I can say that, OneDrive, in this case, it'd be Java, but Java needs to be on this machine in order for this application to run. And so it will automatically install this via this dependency chain. It'll automatically install this before it installs the other application. Now, I can also do supersedence as well. And so supersedence basically allows you to replace or update an application and say that this application supersedes an older application in the environment. And so this is how you would manage application updates. Now, oftentimes our applications update themselves. So Chrome, Firefox, they all will update themselves. And so with those applications that update themselves, you don't have to create a supersedence chain. You don't have to upload a new application in Intune because the apps themselves are taking care of the updates on their own. But if you block those, if you block Chrome or Firefox or any other application from auto updating, then it's up to you to create the new application within Intune. And so you can use application supersedence to replace or update an application if you want to. So again, going along the same lines here, I could say that, let's just pretend that I've got a new version of Firefox, and the new one that I'm doing over here, it's going to supersede this old one that I've got. So let's just pretend this OneDrive is my old version of Firefox, or actually I do have an old version of Firefox here. So this is my old version over here, and my new one is what's being uploaded over here on the left. And so let's remove that. So now I'm saying that, do I want to uninstall or not? And so depending on how the applications work, if I'm installing a new version of Firefox, in general, I don't have to uninstall the old one because the new one just installs over the top. And so I don't need to select uninstall. But you might have some applications where you must uninstall the old app before you install the new one. And so you can select, yes, I want to uninstall this old version before I install the new one. So depending on how the application you're replacing works, you may have to select uninstall or not. I'm not going to supersede that. And then I've got scope tags, and then I've got assignments. And the assignments here are exactly the same as what I showed earlier. However, we didn't go through all the different options. So if I assign my application here, I can assign to a group, all users are all devices. In this case, I'm just going to select all devices, and I'm going to use a filter. And I'm going to say that I want all of my, all of my devices that are at school XYZ. I created a filter using an autopilot profile that says that all the devices that are enrolled into this school using this autopilot profile, I want all the devices at that school to get this app. So I'm using a filter to filter out from all my devices just those devices that are at that school. I've got a bunch of different options over here for the application type or for the application settings. Like, do I want to show notifications to my end users? Probably not, only for restarts. So I'm going to select no, I only want to show restart notifications. I don't want them to get pop-ups and all this, things that can annoy them. I don't want that to happen. And I can also control delivery optimization priority. So delivery optimization, I'm running out of time here, and so I don't have a whole lot of time to actually explain this, but delivery optimization, essentially, it's a peer-to-peer technology on how we share content amongst different devices. And so this is just basically saying, how should I download the content? Should I do it in the background or should I do it in the foreground? By default, you're gonna 99% of the time you're gonna keep this on background. And then for time zone, how do I want to deploy, or when do I want to deploy the app? As soon as possible, or do I want to do it at a specific time? And so I can come into here and specify the date and time that I want to deploy the application. And I can specify what deadline. So when do I want to make it available, but then when must the application install? And so I can just pick a date out into the future and the actual time that the application will install then. In general, though, I see most customers kind of keeping most of the stuff at default. Maybe the end user notifications, you set this down to restart, only show notifications for restarts. But outside of that, when you're deploying an application, you probably just want it to go as soon as possible for the most part. And then we can also make applications available, and I talked about that earlier. And so this application now can go out and deploy. I'm not going to deploy it because I've already deployed Firefox, but you get the idea of how the deployment is done. Now, one last thing on the catalog that I talked about earlier. So I've got a machine here that I'm deploying a bunch of applications to. I've deployed Chrome already. That was a required app. But what if I wanted to make specific applications available for my students or for my end users, and I want them to go and pick and choose the apps that they install? Well, in order to do that, you need to deploy an application called the company portal to your machines. And the company portal application, it's an application that you get from the Microsoft Store. And so you need to integrate the Microsoft Store with Intune. And once you do that integration, you'll have the ability to download or to synchronize the applications from the store into the Intune portal, so you can deploy the applications out to your devices. And so what I've done is I've deployed the company portal app to this virtual machine, and I've also made available a number of applications from my environment. So I've made available Firefox and Adobe Reader and Minecraft and all these other ones. And so as an end user, I can come here and I can go and install an app. So let's say a teacher tells the students, hey, okay, you need to install Minecraft. And the IT department has deployed Minecraft to that group of users. And so the teacher tells the students, okay, go select Minecraft from the company portal. And so they go to the company portal, they go and select Minecraft, and they click on install. Now, this is going to take a little bit for me to download and install this, so it's not going to happen immediately. But after a while, the application will download, it'll install, and it'll be accessible for the users to use. Now, in my environment here, I've got a custom start menu. This is an environment that I've designed really for younger students, so they get a full screen start menu with big squares and big tiles that they can select. It's very easy for them to use, and I've hidden the rest of the application so they really can't access anything. And so once Minecraft installs, there's a tile that this is going to populate with that Minecraft application, and they'll be able to just use that to get to Minecraft later on. And so I've really customized and locked this experience down just for those students. But it's going to take a little while for that application to install. So in the meantime, what I want to point you to is there's a document here within our docs page that goes over how to deploy the company portal app. It says for autopilot provision devices. It really isn't only for autopilot. I would take this out. But what this does, though, is it shows you, it walks you through how to configure the store for business to synchronize your applications into from the store into Intune. So you can eventually get to the point where you'll see this company portal offline application. This is what you would deploy to your devices. And so in my environment, I've deployed this to all of my machines. And so this will go out to every machine and install. I've got an exclude filter here for my laptop SE autopilot devices, but this will go to every other machine outside of those machines. And so my students can go and click on the portal and install whatever application they want. So I'll put this in the slide deck, and we'll send the slides out to you guys, so you have this material. But once you have this set up, you've got the company portal app on the devices. The last thing you need to do is just make the applications available to your students. So when we look at Minecraft, I've got this Minecraft Education Edition application that's synchronized from the store. And this application has been made available to my users. I know I'm going a little quick here. Sorry, I'm just trying to be cognizant of time. But right here, it says available for enrolled devices. The application is available to all my users, and it's not a required app. So again, when you make applications available, the only way they can be installed is through the company portal application. And so every application that you see here, it's just targeted to a group of users and been made available to them. It's not been required. And so that's the difference. And this is, again, going back to the logos thing I was talking about earlier, this is what you see when you don't have logos assigned to your application. So you want to make sure that you're adding the logos. So it makes for a much better experience. It's much easier visually for people to know, oh, I'm installing Minecraft. You know, if I zoom, I'd have a nice blue icon. So you kind of get the idea. All right, with that, we've got 4 minutes. Let me stop here. I know that I've got a few folks from my team answering questions. Anything that I need to respond to from the chat?
Looks like questions have been answered very efficiently. So thank you so much for those folks chiming in the chat and asking your questions. There was one question that was asked. So in the tool to see effectiveness permission for a particular setting, like effective permissions tab, if we deploy config profiles that conflicts with each other, question mark?
Oh, so how do we determine which are conflicted? I think that's the gist of the question. Okay.
Yes.
So conflicts are interesting. So when I look at so what's the best way to show this? Let's see. So when you generate your reports, go under reporting, go to device configuration. When you generate the report, it's going to show you all the different profiles that you have in your environment. And that's going to show you there's a column over here. You can see it. It's kind of grayed out a bit. There's a conflicts node here, or conflicts column. And it'll tell you of all of your profiles. Like I don't have any conflicts, so you won't see it. But this will tell me which of my profiles have a conflict. And then once I find that there's a conflict here, I could then go and look, okay, if I had like a 1 here and a 1 here or something, I could go and see, okay, there's probably a setting that's shared amongst, these 2 separate profiles. And I'd go in and then I'd find the conflict and figure it out. You can also see these in various other places within the console. So if you go look at a device, and you look at the device configuration settings, you'll see in here, like, again, I don't have any conflicts in my environment, but if there were conflicts at a device level, you can look to see the profiles that have been assigned and the state that they're in. If there's a conflict, you'd see it here. You could then click into it and see what setting was conflicted and how, and what other profile it's in, and then go and fix that. So a couple different ways to see what's actually in conflict. Any other questions?
Yeah, we just got another question from Tony. Where does the Intune deploy package on the local machine? SCCM does the CCMCA.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I see it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
It's definitely a mouthful. So so SCCM uses the CCM cache folder that sits under C Windows CCM cache. Within Intune, it's actually there's a program data folder where IME cache. There's an IME cache folder that is on the device, and that's where the content is stored. Off the top of my head, I don't have the exact path, but there's if you see something called IME cache, then that folder is where all the content's located. So different place. What else? MS Store for Business offline right now for us. Yeah, so the Store for Business, again, you'll need, if you're in Intune and you look at the tenant administration, there's connectors and tokens here. If you're saying that this is offline, you need to go through this doc here, which here, let me post this link in the chat. Yeah, it looks like Kathy's got the IME folder there. The link in the chat that I just posted, this is how you'll set up the company portal application. There's this big old thing here on how to manually sync. The links in the doc don't work. So like this link right here. Is that just taking you back? Yeah, that's there. This link here. Yeah, so it should redirect you to educationstore.microsoft.com if you're an education customer. So in my tenant, it's going education store. And then you'd go under Manage and then Settings and follow whatever the steps were in that previous doc. If it's offline for you and you can't access it, that might be something that's going on in your environment, your network. Not quite sure. Okay, there's a question. Are you able to import Firefox ADMX files into Intune? Yes, you can import the Firefox ADMX files. That's possible. I don't know if we're going to add Firefox like we did with Chrome. That might be something we do in the future. We just know that Chrome is obviously the most used browser. So everyone's always asking for easy ways to do that. John's asking, when you see not compliant on a device, what does that mean and how do you rectify it, or do you need to? So you probably saw in my tenant where I've got a ton of devices that shows not compliant. The reason I have so many in my tenant that aren't compliant is because I'm constantly re-imaging VMs all the time. I'm, demoing, presenting, and so oftentimes the devices they're not on long enough for the compliance data to actually be rectified, and so the devices just show up as not compliant. But not compliant isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not compliant ties into conditional access within Intune and Azure Active Directory. So if you're using conditional access basically says, I'm going to allow a user to get access to a resource. It could be Office 365. You could say, hey, in order for them to get access to their email or to get access to Teams or SharePoint, their device needs to be compliant. Well, how does a device become compliant or not? Well, it becomes compliant or not because you have a compliance policy in Intune. And so in compliance policies, which we didn't really talk much about today, but with compliance policies, I can say that a device, again, a lot of my devices aren't compliant. Well, why aren't they compliant? Well, it's most likely because they don't have one of these settings configured on the device. So in my compliance setting, I'm looking at device health, like I'm requiring BitLocker. Well, if my devices aren't on long enough for BitLocker to actually encrypt the hard drive, then I'm never going to be compliant. But I also have other things like device properties where I can say the device must be a minimum operating system version. If I have SCCM, I can say that the device must meet the SCCM compliance settings that I have over there in order to be compliant in Intune. I've got various other security settings from password types to encryption to the firewall needs to be turned on, TPM needs to be there, Defender needs to be on. I've got to have a specific version. So there's a lot of security things that go into my compliance policy. And if I meet all of these, then I'm flagged as compliant and I can get access to any data that is being restricted by conditional access. But if you're not using conditional access and you go into Intune and you see a bunch of things that are just showing as non-compliant, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It looks bad. Someone comes into here, if your manager comes and sees this, like, why aren't we compliant? Like, that's a huge red flag to them, right? They're going to say, hey, that looks bad. Let's fix that. Well, it's pretty easy to fix it, actually. If you see this, but you're not really using compliance policies, or you've got a default compliance policy here, there's a setting. I think we may have moved it. There used to be a setting here under compliance policies. I'm not seeing it anymore, but there was a setting. Maybe I'm in the wrong spot. Yeah, okay. Under compliance policy settings here, there's a setting that says mark devices with no compliance policy assigned as compliant or not compliant. If you don't have any compliance policies whatsoever and you see a bunch of devices show as not compliant, then it's probably because you have this settings turned on right here. Select that as not compliant, and then those machines, or I'm sorry, select this as compliant, and then those machines should all start to flag as compliant, and then that list will be completely green for you. That list should be all green for you if you don't have any compliance policy settings and they're currently red. So that's that. What else we have? Okay, so that is great. Thanks. Okay, perfect. All right, guys. Well, I know we're over time a little bit, but thanks for those that have stuck around. Melanie, if there's anything else that you or the OETC team wants to say or chime in with, I'm done from my side.
All right. Thank you so much, Richard. That was amazing. I hope you guys all enjoyed the session. It will be posted on the OET website within the next week or so. And I did post my email in the chat. If you do have additional questions, please reach out. Other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Great. Thanks a lot, guys. Take care.